just to start by recording in progress. Awesome. Great. So yeah, I guess just to start by covering a few goals for our time together tonight. We're going to begin by giving just kind of an overview of climate justice and energy justice in Boston. We'll use some local examples to really indicate not only how our climate is changing, but to show systemically how climate change impacts low-income and minority communities. And the third goal of this session is to point towards organizations and projects happening around us right now that are working to address climate change in an equitable way. So the work that we're presenting tonight is really grounded in climate justice. So I think it's helpful if we define that first. Climate justice is a movement that addresses the disproportionate social, economic, public health, and other adverse impacts that climate change has on marginalized populations, most notably communities of color and low-income communities. And when we talk about climate change, it's important to talk about how changes in storm frequency, temperature, precipitation, et cetera, impact different communities. Certain groups of people consistently experience more intense climate change impacts, despite contributing the least to climate change. And so this fact is really at the root of kind of everything that we'll be discussing and presenting tonight. And so we'll be looking at some of the root causes of this injustice, and we'll be starting to think about ways that we can advance more equitably. And so to start, I mentioned that we'd have a few polls popping up throughout the night. And this is our first one. So would like to invite you all to kind of chime in and answer this poll. If you were in Boston this summer, really anywhere, you may have noticed kind of just how hot it really was. And so curious what you all think here. I know it's, for me, it seemed like kind of the heat waves never really ended over the summer. Even before then, it was pretty hot out too. Let's give it a little bit longer. All right, so you can see a lot of folks thinking 20 days, 24 days, somebody thinking 30 days, definitely trending to the higher side, which is correct. 24 days this year, we're over 90 degrees in the city of Boston. And so, I'm sorry, here we go. And so kind of we can take that fact about heat waves with us into this next slide. And we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that climate change impacts some communities more than others. And one clear example of this is observing land surface temperature in the city. And so on the left side of the screen is a map showing racial and ethnic minority populations in Boston. And it becomes pretty clear pretty quickly just how racially segregated Boston is today. And unfortunately, race and income are great predictors for exposure to environmental hazards and health disparities. And so on the right side of the slide here, you can see land surface temperatures. And if we compare the two maps, we can see that areas with high minority populations are also experiencing higher temperatures. Lack of tree cover, expansive impervious surfaces, and other factors contribute to this phenomenon. And as a result, residents living in these areas are inherently experiencing more hardships, which may be physical, they may be economic, they may be public health related, when compared to others living in parts of the city that have lower land surface temperatures. And so knowing that heat waves are a major public health risk, especially to vulnerable populations, this becomes really important as we think about advancing equitably. And so as the city does do that, as the city plans and charts a path forward, it's important that these communities are closely involved in planning processes to ensure that, yes, greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, but that they're done so in a way that is equitable across all communities. And though it's not the focus of this presentation, tree equity is another strong indicator of equitable climate impacts. Tree cover provides tremendous assets to communities through cooling and filtering air, cleaning water, and just kind of generally providing welcoming, connected social environments. And in many cities, Boston included, dense tree canopy is tied to neighborhoods that tend to be whiter, more affluent, and more majority made up of homeowners. And here you can see that darker shades of green indicate denser areas of canopy cover. And if we look at these three maps all together, it starts to become very apparent pretty quickly that the same populations are impacted by climate change and other factors, but to a greater extent, time and time again. And when we start to ask why these impacts might be felt harder by certain communities, we can start to trace the answer back pretty clearly. And so while there are many factors that may have led to this, one major thing that we can look at is residential and home ownership patterns in Boston, and the fact that they're inherently tied to decades of government-sanctioned systemic discrimination coming out of the Great Depression. And through the 1930s and 40s, the US Federal Housing Authority would explicitly not insure mortgages to families in communities of color. And so during this time, white families were able to generate wealth and advance their economic status, while communities of color were not. And the Federal Housing Authority would eventually go as far as to work with banks to issue low interest loans to people of color, but when doing so would restrict them to parts of Mattapan and Dorchester. And so redlining and its impacts is a topic that we could talk about for hours, but it's important to touch on it even briefly here tonight, as we get to talk about advancing to a just transition to renewables. And so if you look at the map, it's a little difficult to read, but if you look at the map, kind of the red section just below where you can see there's a page break, are the neighborhoods that we're talking about. So we're looking namely at Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. And this map was produced by the Homeowners Loan Corporation and would guide decisions regarding whether or not banks would issue loans to households. So you can see the scale ranging from green being ranked best all the way to red being ranked hazardous. And so we see strong impacts persisting today and being a major driver of inequity in Boston. And so we'll keep looking at this map a bit longer and start to talk about social vulnerability and climate justice in Boston. Socially vulnerable communities contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but they're often the first and worst to be impacted by climate change. And a point to stress here is that communities are not inherently or naturally vulnerable, yet calculating social vulnerability gives us a way to really quantify inequities across neighborhoods. And so social vulnerability acknowledges deficiencies, different policy failures, and systemic inequities that have really made communities vulnerable. And we can generally think of socially vulnerable communities as being those with higher concentrations of people of color, areas where a larger portion of the population is made up of children under the age of 18 or adults over the age of 65, higher number of low-income households, or a larger number of people with disabilities. And so this map that we're showing now that just appeared shows social vulnerability in Boston. And when we look at social vulnerability in Boston, there are some very clear ties to the map that we've been looking at over the last few slides, from the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And so here in this new map, areas shaded in lighter orange have lower calculated vulnerability indexes, and areas shaded in darker red have higher indexes. And so we continue to see the theme of the same communities being impacted the most time and time again. If we look across the city of Boston, the social vulnerability index is 35. In Back Bay, which is a highly affluent area, the index drops down to 20. And in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan, we see this number jump up to the high 40s. And this is some of the highest throughout the city in all of Boston. So as we continue this conversation, we can look at housing insecurity today and continue to compare this to the same reference map. And so here, darker reds and oranges indicate communities that on average spend more on their housing costs. And so again, we're just perpetually layering on impacts from political actions taken decades ago that are heightening vulnerability in certain communities more than others. And so I think we're going to pause here again to launch our next poll, thinking about housing costs across the US. And so curious what folks think, where Boston ranks in terms of rental costs compared to other cities in the United States. And we'll give that a little bit. Thanks everybody for participating. We'll give it a little bit longer. so we can see what folks are thinking. And for those of you who thought that Boston might rank third, you are correct, behind New York and San Francisco. And so we can keep kind of thinking about inequitable impacts of climate change, and we can see it play out in the distribution of different pieces of infrastructure as well. And so when we look at project siting, we can see that 55% of people who live less than 2 miles from hazardous waste facilities are people of color. In terms of exposure to pollution, Black communities are exposed to 56% more air pollution than they produce, while Latinx communities are exposed to nearly 2/3 more air pollution than they produce. And when we think about energy expenses, low-income households in the US spend 3 times more on their energy bills than non-low-income households, despite consuming less energy. And this relationship between energy costs and income drives a lot of our work at Solstice. And we can think of this relationship as energy burden. And when we say energy burden, it's a simple calculation that revolves around the proportion of household income that is spent on energy costs. So similar to a social vulnerability index, which we were talking about before, looking at an energy burden can help us compare inequities kind of quantitatively across different communities. And once again, we're gonna pause and launch another poll. Energy burden, we can think of it as being driven by a number of factors. So things from the physical, we're thinking about housing stock, maybe kind of inefficient appliances. We could think about economic status, economic hardships and difficult choices that folks might have to make. Or we can think about policies and different available programs that might be out there, or different behavioral choices that we all make are all kind of drivers of energy burden. So curious, as folks answer this question, what you or someone you know may have experienced. And thanks everybody for participating. Give it a little bit longer. Great, so not surprisingly, we see everything popping up to some degree. So now we can look at energy burden locally here in Boston. This map shows average energy burden across the city. And so we can see the scale range from the 0 to 1% range, all the way up to 11%. And again, energy burden being the proportion of household income that is spent on energy costs. And so it's interesting when we look at this map, if you know that the average energy burden across the Commonwealth is a little bit over 3%. However, we can see that here that parts of Dorchester and Roxbury are well above that average. For example, the average energy burden, the average energy burden rate in Grove Hall is 7%. And so when we look back at this map that we've been comparing to a few other pieces of data and maps, we can just start to see kind of what may have set the stage for this phenomenon and for other inequities that we've been discussing. And energy burden coupled with other inequities can lead to the impossible choice of making different regular payments. A recent study showed that 1 out of 5 US households had reduced or abstained from necessities such as buying food or medications to pay for an energy bill. And recently, researchers at Boston University collected a series of interviews from Dorchester residents, asking them about their experience with their energy use and really documenting that. And so I'll pause here for a second and we can read these together, but the first being stress, it adds stress. It's silly sometimes, but I think like, geez, my lights are gonna shut off, even though I know they won't, but even if I'm behind a few days, a week, I worry about a lot of things. The bills vary by season. summertime, gas is slightly lower than electricity. And then, wintertime, gas is much, much higher, extremely higher than electricity. As for summertime, electricity is obviously higher because of air conditioning. It's so hot, and we live on the 3rd floor. It is burning hot. And so it's interesting to hear the kind of firsthand reactions to some of the data points that we've been discussing. And so following up on that, one last poll, and knowing that these answers are fully anonymous, and it's a question that we've kind of asked ourselves too at Solstice, but thinking about impacts of energy burden that you may have experienced, or someone you know, or someone that you know may have experienced. So ranging from impacts to physical health, to economic hardship, to mental health. Just think about the stress that this might put onto people. We'll give this some time. Thanks everybody for participating. Give it a little bit longer. So again, not surprisingly, seeing everything come into play. There's no one impact when we talk about kind of systemic issues and problems like these. And so now with that, I would like to hand things over to our other presenter tonight, Winslow Lewis.
Thanks, Eli. And great to meet you all. Good to be here with you this evening. My name is Winslow Lewis. I'm a program coordinator for Solstice Initiative. And to start, I know we've run through a couple of definitions already, but I want to start by defining energy justice, as it is the topic of tonight's presentation. And we took this definition from the Initiative for Energy Justice, which is an organization in Boston, does a lot of thought leading in this space, but their definition is energy justice refers to the goal of achieving equity in both the social and economic participation within the energy system. It also remediates social, economic, and health burdens on those disproportionately harmed by the energy system. And it's really just about centering the concerns of marginalized communities within conversations around energy and making energy more accessible, affordable, clean, and democratically managed for all communities. You can move on to the next slide. Energy justice is really a means of combating energy insecurity. I know we're introducing a lot of terms here, but energy insecurity is really just the state of continuously experiencing energy burden. So if month after month, you're paying a disproportionate amount of your income on energy, then that leads to energy insecurity, the state of being energy insecure. And the drivers of energy burden are the same as energy insecurity. It's really about, economic means, and folks experiencing economic hardship are more likely to fall into energy insecurity, as well as those with less efficient housing stock. If the heat you're producing in your house is leaving as fast as you're producing it, you're going to spend more on energy and you're going to use more energy. And when we look at Boston specifically, if you want to click, Eli, to the next portion of the slide, 50% of low-income households in Boston have an energy burden greater than 10%. So meaning they spend 10% or more of their income on energy. 25% of low-income households in Boston have an energy burden greater than 18%. And when we look at those numbers, it's not just about energy, is it? I mean, that impacts your whole life, your whole daily existence. That money they're spending on energy could be spent on healthcare or education or housing or just leisurely activities, quality of life. So energy insecurity, it goes so far in impacting our daily lives, and it is important to call out And I know we've been focusing on the issue tonight thus far, and rightfully so. There's a lot of angles to explore with it. But I do want to start to turn to talking about pathways to solutions, to energy justice, to an energy system that's for the people and by the people. And for us, that starts with community leadership. It starts with a bottom-up approach. It starts with collecting input from the community on decisions that really do impact them, like where an energy producing facility is placed, or where clean energy is placed, and who it really benefits first. So community leadership is a really important first step in ensuring energy justice. Also, this is all about energy burden, right? That's a huge part of this. And so energy justice is a movement to combat energy burden. And that means delivering consistent savings to people's utility bills, so they're spending less on their energy, also making our electrical grids more resilient and less prone to blackouts during extreme weather events. So people are keeping the lights on, and health facilities can keep their power to their patients. Same with elder care facilities. So that's a huge piece of this as well. And then lastly, we know that energy systems, they don't just produce energy. Clean energy systems, they don't just produce energy. They don't just produce cost savings. They also produce careers, good paying jobs within the green economy. And what would it look like if community impact in terms of workforce development was prioritized when it came to these projects? And beyond that, what would it look like for people in school, youth, to be learning about these opportunities from a very young age? So these are a couple pathways to energy justice that Solstice is exploring within our work, and many other groups in the Boston area are exploring through their work. And we can talk about some of those groups now. There is no one way to do work around energy justice. And all these organizations on this slide really approach this issue from very different ways. On the energy front, there's a group called All in Energy. That's a nonprofit. It's based in Boston. They're working with Mass Save, which is a state-sponsored program led by your utilities, so Eversource, National Grid. And they're offering free home energy assessments and give away free energy saving devices to those that income qualify. And just to all of our residents of Boston. So it's a really good service. We haven't talked much about energy efficiency tonight, but it's a great way for people to save money on their energy bills and also make their homes healthier. ABCD, or Action for Boston Community Development, offers a range of services. They're another nonprofit in the Boston area. They don't just work on energy, but they do also work on energy. And they'll go as far as advocating for you when you have overdue energy bills. They'll go to National Grid and have your back there. And they can also replace folks' heating systems, oftentimes for no cost. So really important services. And if you're not in a place where you're needing those services right now, you can also volunteer for this amazing organization and help your neighbors get the support they need. And finally, Speak for the Trees is a nonprofit that works on improving the health, environment, and resilience of our under-resourced communities in Boston through tree plantings. So they're working on that urban canopy issue that Eli highlighted previously in this presentation. Working with Speak for the Trees, you can bring more trees to your community by adopting a tree, watering it, taking care of it day after day, making sure, not day after day, it doesn't take that much work, but making sure it's taken care of. Also joining community-wide tree planting events where you can connect with neighbors and really make a difference within your community. So these are a few organizations, and the last one that we definitely want to highlight as we're partaking in their presentation series is CREW, Communities Responding to Extreme Weather. We are taking part in their Climate Preparedness Week, and they have a suite of events planned for the rest of the week. So you should definitely check out their website. I believe it's bostoncrew.org, but we'll send information about all of these organizations when the webinar is over. So with that, I want to turn to an informal poll. If folks could sound off in the chat about why energy justice matters to them. So we've talked about energy justice from many different angles now, but want to bring it to the personal level again and just talk about why it matters to you. So if people want to jump into the chat, thank you, Diana, for prompting it. As folks are adding their thoughts to the chat, we can talk through why energy justice matters to Solstice. Our work is really centered around bringing valuable, accessible, clean energy to low-income communities and communities of color. And clean energy projects, we know they produce so much value, but this value rarely reaches historically marginalized communities. So that's why we're working to create a future where accessible clean energy powers thriving communities. And I see a couple of people adding their thoughts to the chat. Thank you for that. And we have to remember, it's not just about us, but it's about future generations deserving a clean planet. So with that, I can pass it back to Eli to give a bit more detail about our work at Solstice Initiative.
Yeah, thanks, Winslow. So we've talked a lot about energy burden. We're starting to think about kind of some possible solutions. And one way to reduce energy burden is by expanding access to solar energy. And so not only, oops, sorry, just had a poll results pop up. So not only is solar renewable and therefore kind of more beneficial to communities than fossil fuels, but it's also cheaper for households to access. And so community solar is a more accessible form of solar, and it's really our focus here at Solstice. An easy way to think about it might be to think of a community garden or a rideshare program, a situation where multiple people are kind of benefiting from one shared resource. In this case, that's a shared solar farm. And so it really removes barriers to installing solar on your own home. You don't have to be a homeowner. You don't have to have the kind of cash up front to install a solar system, solar panels on your house. Maybe you have an older roof and it's just kind of out of the question. And when we kind of add up all these different factors, we end up learning that 80% of Americans, for one reason or another, many of whom are low income, are unable to access solar energy. And so having this opportunity to participate in a shared solar farm can be really beneficial. And not only does it aid in electrifying and greening the grid, but ultimately participants will receive credits to their utility bill. So we'll see a savings on their monthly bill. And so yes, there is that kind of financial saving that comes from participating in a community solar project. You can think about that as one way to lessen your energy burden. But another benefit, and something that Winslow spent some time discussing and sharing, is just thinking about energy justice and the opportunity for these projects to really expand access to communities that traditionally are left out of the transition to renewables, that have a harder time entering the green economy. And kind of similarly, we can think about investing in local communities. Community solar really at its kind of baseline, allowing for a collection of local individuals, whether those be households or small businesses, to really come together on a shared project. And so kind of build relationships throughout that work. And lastly, of course, there are the environmental benefits. We talked earlier about the inequities in exposure to pollution or to different pieces of infrastructure and energy generating facilities. And so if we can lessen that impact, and we can build projects that are renewable, that do green the grid, that do expand access to all populations and everybody, that'd be great. So that's some benefits of community solar. Unfortunately, community solar does not always, and has not historically in Massachusetts, effectively expanded access to communities that would really benefit the most. Although we see solar energy really booming in Massachusetts and nationally, the benefits have really yet to effectively reach low income and communities of color. In fact, we see that less than 5% of the hundreds of community solar projects built in Massachusetts have been designed specifically to benefit low-income residents. And so this lack of access isn't solely an income issue. As majority Black and Latinx communities have 69% and 30% less solar than majority white communities, regardless of their income status. And so these rates are also similar, it's important to note, when controlling for home ownership. So we see that something that theoretically could do a great job of expanding access and equity has not always done that to date in Massachusetts. And so kind of ending and closing a little bit, discussing our work at Solstice and how we're trying to change this a little bit. We're trying to model projects that really do provide benefit, increased value and access to solar to low-income communities and to communities of color, groups that have been marginalized and kind of left out of this transition to a more resilient future. And so we're doing that really by working in step with community from day zero, from the beginning. So rather than kind of an outside solar developer coming in and building a project, we're working closely with local champions, stakeholders, individual residents, nonprofits in the area to really lead the project. And so Solstice can kind of take a step back and act as a facilitator, a knowledge sharer, and guide conversations, but really defer key project decisions to people who are living locally. And we talked earlier about the systemic reasons for why Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan have kind of seen the climate impacts that they have, some of the reasons we've touched on. And so this is the area, we talked about energy burden there as well, and seeing high social vulnerability indexes in these neighborhoods too. And so this is the focus of our work right now, is working with local champions and leaders in these three neighborhoods to establish a community solar project that will provide meaningful benefit and value to households and businesses there. And so through that, not only creating a community solar project, but also looking at how we can increase workforce development opportunities related to not only to solar, but renewables in general, and really think about the ways that we can add other pieces of value to the project as well. So that's one way that we're trying to think about kind of creating a different project, using a different model that we think really will add value. And so to close up and wrap up, you hear all the time that people are more likely to do something if you write it down or if you tell a friend or a family member. And so we're going to ask you guys to sign off in the chat one more time to share something that you might commit to kind of helping fight for energy justice, to make your neighborhood or your home more efficient and healthy. We have some things listed on the slide here right now, but of course, those aren't the only things that we can all do. So we welcome everybody to share something either in the chat, or we also have a poll that's open now too, that lists some options as well. Give the poll a little bit more time. Thanks everybody for sharing. Now we can see, again, great to see kind of a spread in what people might take up and join. So with that, we reached the end of our presentation. And thank you all for joining us. And I'm not sure if any questions have come in over the course of myself and Winslow kind of running through the slides that we did. If they did, we can address those, I guess, or also we have some time right now as well. So feel free to kind of leave those in the chat or to use the Q&A function in Zoom as well. We do have some time.
So this just got sent in the chat, but I think it's worth calling out too. We do have time, as you guys said. If anyone wants to speak, join us on this call. More than welcome to speak to the group with us. Just raise your hand, and Diana in the chat can help you do that. And we'll take questions through the chat or through the Q&A button in Zoom that's right at the bottom of your screen there. So it looks like we got one question here. Thank you to the asker. Are there any local policies supporting community solar we could get involved in? Yeah, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, there are definitely a few kind of great pieces of legislation that are being pushed right now. And I would direct folks to some great organizations that are kind of leading these priorities, these legislative priorities. 350 Mass comes to mind as a great organization who's pushing forward some great work, as well as the Mass Climate Action Network. They both sponsored a few different bills that are making their way through the House and Senate. One that comes to mind is an act providing for building justice with jobs. So looking at expanding access to good jobs. And that's sponsored by Mass Renews Alliance, which is kind of a stem and an offshoot of 350 Mass. So that's a great one that comes to mind. Yeah, I would really recommend, and we can share some information as well after this in an email, but checking out organizations like that and looking at kind of their legislative priorities is a great way to get involved and see what's happening.
Excellent. More coming in. Next question is Solstice the only local organization doing community solar? I'm happy to answer that one. The short answer is no. There are many organizations in the community solar space. There's a ton in Boston even, and in Massachusetts. What is slightly different about our model compared to what community solar is really predominant within the space is that we're a nonprofit, and so we can take longer with our projects. We can do this community centered model. We can go to the community and get the directives for our projects from the community, and we can really focus the entire project around maximizing the benefit for the community that's actually going to be the host of the project, wherever this community solar project is. So that's just something more about our work, but there are plenty of organizations in Massachusetts that are doing community solar, and there are probably some community solar farms that folks can sign up for now, and we'll definitely direct you to some resources where you can find different community solar farms in your area, and then also stay in the know about the project that we're developing in Dorchester, Roxbury, and Mattapan. So I saw this one come through. How much savings would I get if I were to join a community solar garden? Eli, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it can vary. based on project, and that's something that based on the project, and that's something that we're really working and to kind of have first and foremost in our minds when we're thinking about this project that we're speaking to kind of at the end of this presentation. Typically, you might expect to see a 10% savings that may come through kind of your standard community solar product, your standard offering. And there's a question there of kind of how much value that really adds to households where energy burden is very high. And is that kind of 10% number going to make a meaningful impact and have a difference day to day? And so that's something that we're really excited to discuss with our community advisory board on this project that we're mentioning in Dorchester and Roxbury and Mattapan, to come up with a number that would be meaningful and would be impactful to people's lives. And then because of our kind of role in the project and our position as a nonprofit, and how can we lean on kind of other mission-driven financiers and entities to work towards a way where we can really increase that number from 10% to something higher, to something that may have a greater impact on kind of the day-to-day lives of individuals. See another question coming in asking about resources to learn more about kind of energy system, whether those be books or documentaries or podcast episodes. We definitely have a few that we've shared among our team, things that we like that are pretty accessible, different podcasts and kind of books as well. And we can definitely share some of those in an email kind of following up. There's definitely some great ones out there, but Winslow, do any come to mind right now?
Yeah, I'll call a couple out. There's a book called Revolutionary Power by Shalonda Baker, who actually works for the Department of Energy right now in their Office of Impact and Diversity. And yeah, it's a pretty comprehensive book, really exploring all elements of the energy system and the clean energy transition from the perspective of an activist. And we love Shalonda. She used to be a board member of ours and just is doing really amazing work in this space. So that's one I would check out. And then if you want to get into the nerdy side, there's a podcast called The Energy Gang that really discusses clean energy development from a multitude of angles, but tends to be more industry focused, but definitely worth checking out as long as you can put up with some acronyms that might be hard to get on the first go around.
Great. Well, seeing no more last minute questions trickle in, just want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, spending an hour of your Tuesday night with us. Thanks for joining. And like we've been mentioning, we're definitely going to follow up with a little bit more information about some of the programs that we mentioned and spoke about, as well as just kind of some of these other resources that we're talking about right now. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. And also a reminder to check out other events hosted by Crew that might be happening throughout the week. There's some really interesting ones. So thank you all so much. Have a good night.
Thanks, everybody. Good night.
Is it over?